Welcome, and thank you for tuning into Things That Matter, a show where we, not so surprisingly, discuss things that matter, particularly around theological and justice topics. I am the Reverend Dr. Mark Sandlin, and will be moderating this panel discussion. I serve as president and co executive director of ProgressiveChristianity.org, the organization that created Things That Matter. My friend, colleague, and Progressive Christianity.org board member, Dr. Sharon Jacob, is joining us as well and will be co-moderating today. Today's topic is on confronting the Christian nationalist anti-LGBTQ plus stance, particularly as we move into election season and it's being weaponized to motivate conservative voters, with even more than 250 conservative anti-LGBTQ plus bills being introduced across the U.S. this year alone. We are joined by three panelists: Reverend Jacob Hiroshaw, Reverend Luther Young Jr., and Erin Green, all of whom I will be introducing more thoroughly in just a moment. We will begin by asking each of our panelists to give their thoughts on today's topic, and then we'll have a Q&A segment where we will ask our guests to respond to some of your questions. So just leave those questions in the comment section wherever you are viewing. That said, let's now go to our panel for their initial responses on today's topics. First, we have the Reverend Luther Young Jr., who is an artist, public theologian, and social justice advocate. He is an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and currently serves as the council moderator of the Disciples LGBTQ plus Alliance, known as Alliance Q, and a member of the board of directors for Q Christian Fellowship. He earned his master's degree from Vanderbilt University Divinity School and a Master of Arts degree in sociology from The Ohio State University, where he's currently a PhD candidate in sociology with an interest in the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and religion. Much of Luther's academic and community work seeks to address class inequalities, racial injustice, and systems of discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community and other disadvantaged groups. In particular, his current research investigates the cause and effect of homophobia in predominantly Black churches. His recently published article, To Condemn or Not to Condemn, in Sociology of Religion, Oxford Press, examines how homophobia in the Black church is expressed and perceived by parishioners and suggests potential ways to address non-affirmation in these spaces. He is a native of Beaufort, South Carolina. Luther now, though, lives in Erie, Pennsylvania with his husband, Brian. Luther, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mark, and it is great to be here with this esteemed panel. And thank you for this very timely and important topic on white Christian nationalism and the LGBTQIA plus agenda. I'm reminded of the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. These words in his letter from a jail in Birmingham highlight the importance and the nature of the fact that various forms of oppression are inextricably linked, and that all of our destinies, whether toward justice or injustice, are linked. And I would argue that all of these various forms of oppression that we see today are really rooted in white supremacy, because whiteness is an ideology that places people into a hierarchy, such that some people are able to access resources more easily than others. And so it's important to note in this conversation, I'm sure this will come up again, is that whiteness and white supremacy is not just about skin color. It is an ideology that impacts all of us, to which all of us are prone to be infected with this disease. It's about who is seen who is heard and who is valued the most in our society and who is not. And in our society today in the US, it is still white, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian men who are wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And in this capitalist society, we are socialized to try and climb as far as we can to the top of this ladder, even if that means stepping on other people in the process. The sad reality is, though, that very few of us can actually make it to the top of this ideological ladder that we've created. But yet and still, we literally kill ourselves and others trying to get there. And it is in this process of trying to get to the top that our problem arises. That we kind of get this thing twisted, right? And we think that justice everywhere is a threat to justice for me, as if justice is a finite pie, that if someone else gets a slice, it means a smaller piece for me. Now, perhaps there is some truth to this. I won't be ignorant here, because providing justice for others might necessitate a divestment of our own power and our own privilege. And that is just not something that a lot of us are willing to do. And this is how we get this perpetual system of oppression and supremacy that continues even today. And so what I would suggest is that we need a mental reframing of justice in general, and understand that justice is not an individual property. Justice is inherently communal. I think our Christianity today places too much emphasis on personal salvation, all the while ignoring communal sin. If we go back to the teachings of Judaism, for which our faith arises, much of what the Torah taught us was about how God's people ought to live in community with one another. The laws and the consequences for breaking the laws were not about punishing individuals. Rather, it was about reconciliation and restoring right relationship among the people and between the people and God. And if we fast forward to the New Testament, much of the teachings of Paul and the apostles were concerned about how this new religious movement of Christ's followers that included people from differing backgrounds, identities, and faith traditions should live and function together as Christ's church. So to ignore the needs of the most marginalized in our society, even if they look, act, or think differently than we do, is sin. And to perpetuate such oppression in the name of Christianity is blasphemy. And so, as we look at our politics and our political structure, our goal as Christians should not be to pass legislation and enact policy that will force other people to think or live how we think they should live. Rather, we should seek legislation and policies that will primarily promote liberation and alleviate suffering. So in order to model our Christian values and our public witness, we should actively resist white supremacist ideologies that seek to oppress any particular person or to more justice for all.
Thank you for that, Luther, very much. I really appreciate your words and your perspective. I've already heard several pieces that I am certain that we will be revisiting when we get into our discussion. Next up is the Reverend Jacob Hero Shaw, who's senior pastor at the Metropolitan Community Church in Tampa. Jacob received his M.Div and Certificate of Sexuality and Religion from the Pacific School of Religion, and his M.A. in Ethics and Social Theory from the Graduate Theological Union. He holds a graduate diploma in Christian Theology and Spiritual Direction from Cardiff University in Wales, and a B.A. in Religious Studies with an emphasis on Christianity and Islam from the University of South Florida. He has led trainings on human rights and participated transgender advocacy throughout the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Central and Eastern Europe. Jacob's favorite thing in life is being a dad, and he lives in Tampa, Florida with his husband and their 2 children. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm a pastor. So when I was told to do this in 5 to 7 minutes. That's like a bit of a challenge, but I'm going to do my best. My congregants will be amazed that I got it all out. Can't even get to my first point in 5 minutes. But so I live in Florida, and I want to start by telling you about a sign, a great big sign that's near my house. It's been there for a long time, many, many years. It says, "Guns, God, and guts make America great."
Mm.
And this predated the whole MAGA thing.
Mhm.
This has been there for as long as I can remember. So this idea that it's about guns, it's about God, it's about guts, this like hyper masculine white Jesus, I
Right.
feel like that's really what's at the center of this white Christian nationalism. So I'd like to kind of start by pointing out a little bit about like what we're talking about when we say Christian nationalism. I think some folks maybe have some misunderstandings about it. So it's not just a white person who loves their country and is a Christian. So patriotism, of course, is a different thing. So that speaks to like the ideals of a nation. Nationalism is about a different kind of loyalty to a particular group, and really honestly isn't about the well-being or the love of that nation, but more an allegiance to the group. What it's rooted in is the idea that America was founded by white Christian men who had a divine mandate to be here. And so what fuels it today, what fuels this white Christian nationalism are fear tropes. This and I would say a fetishization of victimhood that places white Christian heterosexual cisgender men as victims, despite all of the evidence that exists that clearly shows that the positions of power in this country are overwhelmingly dominated by people who are white Christian heterosexual cisgender men. Therefore, women, immigrants, people of color, gay people, lesbians, bi people, queer people, trans people, these are all the threats to this idea of white Christian nationalism. And I believe that a lot of this comes back to purity culture, that in the founding of the United States, which comes from this kind of puritanical Protestant culture. So what betrays purity and purity culture? It's all about bodies. Bodies that can get pregnant, bodies that are not white, bodies that have gay sex, bodies that transition away from their assigned gender at birth. These are all examples. I would say also bodies that were not born in this country but come here, despite obviously the history of white people who showed up very much uninvited. So I really come at this as a Floridian. I've lived lots of places, but I grew up in Florida, and I made the choice to return to Florida because I felt that there was some work to be done. To be honest, I planned to come here for 1 year after seminary, and then I met this guy and I got distracted, and now a decade has gone by. And we're very settled here. So I want to talk about what's happening right now, and I'm going to talk about the political ads that we're seeing, which are, to be honest, dehumanizing.
You're right.
So what I'm witnessing on my television and when I'm watching YouTube or whatever are these ads for the upcoming election. And it's all about the threat of immigrants, the threat of trans people, and the threat of reproductive justice. Those are the 3 points that I am witnessing again and again, just being hammered into us. There are other things that come up, but those 3, immigration, trans people, and reproduction. So it's not only white people who espouse white Christian nationalism. This is something that is ingrained in the culture of the United States. And I'm not going to call out any politicians by name, because I value the 501c3 reality. But let me just say that there is an ad that is very much running all the time in my local area from a particular candidate. And what I see in this ad is that there are ideas from white Christian nationalism that supersede other pieces of a person's identity.
Mm-hmm.
So this particular ad starts by saying that this person's family immigrated to this country, and then goes on to say that they know that other immigrants are a threat. And it shows images of people crossing the border, and these folks in the images look dirty, and they make sure to zoom in on the people so you can really see their skin tone as well. So these are people who've been out in the desert, and they're covered in dirt, and they're clearly brown people as well. And then it goes on to talk about the threat of children being taught radical gender identities. That's the term, radical gender identities, in school without parental consent. And it shows images of drag queens reading to children, and a picture of a drag queen putting makeup on a child who appears to be a little boy. The ad also says that they're trying to turn boys into girls. And the person's opponent is a Black woman, and they show footage of her. In the footage, her skin is darker, and the video itself is slowed down. And she's talking emphatically with like a lot of energy, but with it being slowed down, it looks like she's furious. So it is showing the bodily fear of, this is a body to be feared. This is a Black woman who we should be afraid of. And every time I see this footage, I just cringe at the whole thing. So from my own social location, I'm a transgender man. So when they're talking about trans people as threats, really they pretty much forget that people like me exist. But at the same time, even from my places of a variety of types of privilege, I find it so dehumanizing to hear that I am a threat. I've raised 2 kids. I'm not a threat to children. And I look at this and I think, if I am in a place where I have so many different types of privilege and I am feeling taken down and dehumanized by this, what is this doing to people who don't have access to as much privilege as I have? I have a therapist who I can process with, but most people don't have that. And as a pastor, what I'm concerned about is the impact that this has. And I'm over my time, of course, but my concern is not just my congregation, but in a broader sense. I'm concerned about the moral injury that occurs when our humanity is on the line, and political ads that strip away people's humanity. That is just, to my pastor's heart, that just hurts me to my core. And it shows, if someone is willing to use children, and I didn't even talk about the whole thing about the rights for abortion that are being stripped away. Being willing to harm people and harm their bodies in order to get ahead politically. I think that is at the core of all of this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Jacob. I really appreciate you pointing out how dehumanizing it is, but at the same time, really making it personal and helping rehumanize the situation and what's going on. Much appreciated, and we'll be getting back to those issues as well. I want to remind our listeners that if you have questions for the panel, you can just list those in the comment section. Next, we're going to move on to our final guest, who is Erin Green, who is the campus and alumni organizer for Religious Exemption Accountability Project, known as REAP. They are an affirming biblical scholar and LGBTQ plus activist. Erin has a bachelor's of arts in biblical studies from Azusa Pacific University and an M.Div from the San Francisco Theological Seminary. Their specialties are in the entire Christian biblical corpus, with an emphasis on Hebrew Bible, the ancient Near East, exegesis, and how to employ various hermeneutical methods. Erin's passion is helping those excluded by the church to heal from spiritual abuse and trauma by navigating the biblical text in restorative ways. Erin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me. And I'm so excited to be here. I will say that I am not a pastor. I'm an activist, so my bit here will be short and sweet. It will be much shorter. So I want to preface my thoughts on this topic by saying, yesterday I was a part of a nationwide protest to strike out queerphobia at all faith-based colleges and universities across the United States. And it was incredibly successful. I want to say that the kids are all right and things are changing. We are at a turning point, a tipping point, I think. So for as much pushback as we're getting from white Christian supremacy, I think there is a future and a hope with the next generation of students. So I want to kind of tie my thoughts directly into faith-based colleges and universities. And I think that recognizing that there is this vast educational gap when it comes to racism and homophobia in the non-affirming faith-based colleges and university space is very important. But religious institutions, right, are responsible for building churches, for building pastors and clergy, and critical platforms that ultimately contribute to the religious right through white supremacy, through discursive power and dominance. Religious institutions also produce workers in the political sphere, the judicial sphere, the medical sphere, the economic sphere. And this clearly demonstrates how religious colleges in particular are a critical part of the whole ecology of white Christian supremacy. So when I'm thinking about, how do we combat this? How do we work to dismantle this? I'm thinking like, what is the root of the problem? Part of the root for me is the religious institutional space. So I do argue that we must educate the public, especially our white constituencies, to this fact. If we are to make headway in dismantling these powers, we must publicly call out this power and encourage the public to defund these institutions, as well as to demand that our taxpayer dollars cease to fund this pipeline. Because these schools, yes, are private religious institutions, but they're receiving federal dollars to discriminate against LGBTQ plus folks and other people. So I think that's one of the ways, one of the trajectories that we can go down in beginning to dismantle some of these powers. And I'm eager to have more conversation about it, and I love what everybody else had to say. So my talking point was very short, and but I'm eager to discuss more. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. I'm really glad that you were here. You were really hitting on a lot of the points I hope that we get to go more deeply into. Just kind of as an introduction, and I'm going to back up and kind of give a broader question here that each of you have really, in a lot of ways, already answered. But to have a little further discussion about it, specifically about white Christian nationalists and anti-LGBTQ plus stance, do you think that is rooted more in queer phobia, or is it more political, or is it somehow actually truly they think it's rooted in spirituality? What's really going on here in terms of this aggressive negative stance?
I mean, I can start with some of my ideas. I grew up in an evangelical background that I have since walked away from. I no longer affiliate with evangelical Christianity, but the teachings within fundamentalist Christianity are very queerphobic. And I think that this is embedded, right? It was embedded in me as a child this idea of sin management, you know, and that concept that, and, you know, Jacob was talking about bodily autonomy and things like that. So I think it is queer phobic. It starts with the teachings that we receive in church that are disseminated in church. And people have to, in order to overcome their homophobia, have to sort of overcome some sort of fear that they may have toward queer communities.
Right.
But I do think it's not politically stemmed or rooted. I do think it's straight up queer phobic. It's queer phobia, like you were saying, Mark.
Okay. Either of our other guests want to approach that question, or I would be curious to hear from both of the two reverends if, since I agree with Erin very much that there's so much of it's rooted in the church and comes from a queer phobia that's developed out of the church. Could y'all speak to whether or not that's a true Christian spiritual perspective, and how it is that we ended up where we are with so many people, you know, really feeling strongly about it?
I'm happy to
Reverend, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll add a few comments. And I agree wholeheartedly with Erin. And I think for me, it's hard to disentangle, because I think these things are so, have become so linked to each other, such that for many people, spirituality has become co-opted and intertwined in interesting ways with social beliefs and political positions. So when people start to sacralize their political beliefs, right, as a means of justifying their kind of like social positions, I think that that's where we start to get things really weird, such that people's political opinions become gospel. People's instead of the other way around, right? So I believe that as a Christian, I do think that my faith as a Christian and the teachings of Christ should inform how it is, you know, I live my life, and perhaps the political policies that I align with. However, I should not be trying to depict an image of Jesus that, you know, the sign that Reverend Jacob mentioned earlier, God, guns, and guts, right? Like, to me, that illustrates a very clear co-opting of, okay, this is my this is my culture, or this is my social position. Let me just slap a check mark from Jesus on it so that I can say that it's okay. And I think that a lot of us are guilty of doing that, so that these things become inextricably linked. So back to the question that you asked, you know, is it rooted in queer phobia? Is it really rooted in a spirituality? Is it rooted? I think that I think that we have embedded beliefs as people, kind of going back, and I think a lot of it is social, that we tend to then try to find ways to put a religious stamp on it to legitimate our own biases, our own negative images of others, and perhaps images of ourselves, right? That we are then extrapolating onto others, and we just try to find a way to slap a Jesus check mark on it to make it okay.
Right.
Yeah. Jacob, you want to respond?
Yeah, I think that part of this, and it piggybacks well on what Reverend Luther was just saying, is that part of it is just the ick factor, that some people look at what some other people do, and either they're really drawn to it and that scares them, or they're just simply repulsed by it, and they want to find a religious reason to justify discrimination. I'm amazed at how much in evangelical circles they talk about gay sex. They talk about gay sex more than I talk about gay sex. And I'm like someone who has it. So like, I'm just blown away by that obsession. And I also think that a little bit of it is like taking the attention off of maybe some other things that people are concerned that they might be sinning about. Now, I personally don't have any kind of theological problem with someone who is divorced. But it is interesting to me when someone is railing against LGBT folks and they've been divorced and remarried multiple times and they're using scripture. So it's like this pick and choose piece of it. Now, I believe in putting it all in context, and we won't get into the reasoning behind that in great exegetical detail. But it is this idea that we can pick and choose and use the biases that we already have and throw a Jesus label on it, and suddenly, somehow queer folks don't meet the ideal. So that's got to be where the sin is happening.
So, just to add to this conversation, one of the things I wanted to actually ask and have you all think together is, how do we begin to dismantle this kind of white supremacy that is, unfortunately, it is very apparent in communities of color, right? And particularly in church communities of color, where and I think Reverend Luther Young, you actually said, how we're doing bodily harm to ourselves. And as someone who teaches in seminary, I often struggle with getting people of color to read with liberation eyes and for a moment just shatter the glasses of white supremacy that we have been learned, and I'm sure Erin will recognize this too, because we've been taught to read scripture that way. So how do you begin to dismantle those white spaces that are not just in whiteness but also have now infected the people of color spaces, right? How do we begin to even have a conversation about that?
I was hoping you had the answer to that question. It is.
I mean, I have ideas, but yeah.
For sure. I think that is indeed a challenge, and thank you for naming that. I think for me, one of the things, there are a few things that I think are helpful tools. One is looking at historical cultural context. And so that is something that in my writings, in my teaching, whenever I have an opportunity to speak, I try to make references to historical and social context, right? So understanding where many of these beliefs come from, right? Even the ones that we think are religious beliefs, that if we look back and trace the historical lineage, it's really rooted in what's social and what's cultural and what was normative for a particular time period, for a particular group of people in a particular context. That then became kind of, Jesus-fied in a sense. And so when we can start to trace some of that back and say, wait a minute, okay, some of these things that I thought was rooted in scripture or that I thought was rooted in faith is really a social belief or a cultural norm, right? Then I think we can start to peel back that layer. And then also looking at, biblical exegesis and all of those things that take a little bit of work. So I think that looking at history, situating things in context, but then also the biggest thing, and this is also a challenge, is getting people to be in community with one another. And I often find that when people can, and I appreciate the comment earlier from you, Mark, about Jacob humanizing the story, right? When we can look at these things not in the abstract, right? Not as political jargon, not as theological fodder, but as truly issues that impact actual people's lives. And we can see that with our own eyes, right? When I can sit with someone who is being impacted by these things, it makes it a little bit more difficult for me to hold on to some of those beliefs when I can see the suffering happening in front of me. And that's why so many of us are averse, right, to looking at the suffering. We're so averse to talking to people who are different than we. We're so averse to going out on the front lines where some of these issues are taking place, because once we see it, we will be compelled to act. And what we see will conflict with supposedly the spirit that lives within us, and it won't allow us to stay silent. I think so many of us are afraid of that because we're afraid to give up the privilege and everything else that comes with our deeply held beliefs. And so I think that history, but also just real relationships with people, I think that those are just a couple of the ways that we can maybe start to disentangle those things.
Yeah, the empathy, right? To see the humanity in others. Yeah. Others want to add to that? Because I know you'll have thoughts.
I'll speak on this a little bit. I love what was just said about community, and I think that that's such an integral part of dismantling white Christian supremacy. And I have learned more about community from my BIPOC friends than I have from anyone else. So knowing that I want to sit at the feet of that wisdom and that leadership from BIPOC communities leading the way and showing us how to live communally and how to be in community with one another. That is what I want to do. But I also know from that, my duty as a white person and the onus and responsibility that I have is to help educate other white folk and to reel them in, to the truth. I think one of the things that I've noticed with like my white friends and even with me sometimes is that we have a hard time being held accountable for the things that we say or that we do. We have a hard time being held accountable for the history that has happened in this country and all over the world. Rooted in white Christian supremacy and colonialism, colonization, all those things. So I think helping my white friends understand, it's okay to be held accountable because you will still remain in community. And that's one of the things that I've had to learn is that just because you're being held accountable doesn't mean you're getting exiled from community. Right. That's part of being in a communal space is being held accountable, and that's okay. So that's my contribution to this particular, part that Dr. Sharon brought up is just, it's okay to be held accountable. And it's almost a welcome in to community. It's like saying you're a part of this community and I love you so much that I can say this to you and trust that you'll, do better or make it right. Yeah. So those are my thoughts on that.
It makes me think, listening to both Erin, you and Luther, that, and in my own experiences of teaching, that the roots of white supremacy is so deeply entrenched in all of us, right? That to talk about decolonizing or the rooting out as just a one-time thing is really impractical. And I think that's another problem with the way we also are training our leaders. You go to seminary, you learn these hermeneutics, and then that's great, right? But it has to be a constant revisiting and a constant decolonizing that has to keep happening in order to root this out. It's not just a one-time fix, right? What do you think, Reverend Jacob?
Oh, well, I think for one thing, again, like speaking as a white person, that if you're a white person who's in leadership, you absolutely must be talking about this. And we have so much work to do on ourselves and an obligation to each other as white people for that holding accountable piece. Like, it's not turn to the nearest person of color and tell them to educate you. That's like not so good. Now, if you're in a leadership role and you're white and people aren't complaining that you're talking about racial justice, then you probably aren't talking about it enough. Like, push people's limits, make them, and I'm talking push other white people's limits, make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. But there's safer ways to do it. Like Erin was saying, holding people accountable is actually a great sign of care, and getting to be better at doing community. This is like an important thing that when you have spent your whole life, and if you grew up in North America with this implicit message every day of your lives that you are somehow better than other people, unlearning that is hard work, and it's necessary. You cannot do leadership without it.
Right.
Thank you for that perspective. And speaking of doing it in community, it is time for us to wrap up this show. We will be coming back. I'll speak more about that in a few weeks. But speaking of doing it in community, all of our guests are out in the world working in communities for change. And I wanted to present you both with an opportunity to please let us know where else to find you other than right here on this show, and how we can better support your work. Let's start with you, Erin.
Sure, thank you. So as was mentioned earlier, I work for an organization called REAP, the Religious Exemption Accountability Project. You can find us at www.thereap.org. We protect queer and trans students at religious colleges across the United States. It's such a worthy cause. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the socials at REAP_LGBTQ, and you can find us there. But those are great ways to support us, is just getting connected through those mediums.
Fantastic. Jacob?
Well, I'm the senior pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Tampa. We have online services and we have programming that's online. So even if you're not in Tampa, you can participate. You can find out more at mcctampa.com. I'm also on the faculty of the Trans Seminary and Leadership cohort. So if you are a trans person, non-binary person who is training for any type of religious leadership, you can apply to be part of the cohort. You can find info about that at CLGS.org.
And it looks like a little technical difficulty, and we have lost Luther's feed, but you have already heard that he is a voice that you want to be paying attention to. So I encourage you to Google Disciples LGBTQ Plus Alliance or Alliance Q and find out more about the work that he is doing there. It's important, and we really hope you'll support all of our panelists even after this broadcast. So I want to thank all of our panelists, as well as my co-moderator, Sharon, for an intriguing and much needed conversation. We also thank everyone who has tuned in for this conversation. Things That Matter is brought to you by progressivechristianity.org. And we will return in 2 weeks on October 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where we will have a roundtable discussion on this issue with members of our board of directors as we look at specific scripture that relates to the topic. I hope that you will join us then. So until next time, this has been Things That Matter.